Welcome to Simply by DealHQ. On this podcast, we engage thought leaders on topical issues around law and business in the most simplistic manner.
Welcome you to Season 2, Episode 10 of Simply by DealHQ's podcast. In today's conversation, we'll be taking a deep dive into the state of play in Africa's emerging carbon market, and more importantly, determining if and how Nigeria can fulfill its ambition of becoming Africa's biggest carbon trading hub. My name is Tofumi Adekoya, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's episode. We are joined by two leading voices in sustainability and climate who will bring both global and national perspectives on today's subject. Please welcome with me Kasia Lewis, Partner, Sustainability and Global Carbon Markets, EY. Ms. Kasia, it's really a pleasure to have you on today's episode of Simply, and we are honored to have you join this conversation.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I will also be introducing our second speaker, Mr. Ibrahim Shelleng, a Senior Special Assistant to the President of Nigeria on Climate Finance and Stakeholder Engagement. It's truly a great honor to have you on today's episode, sir, and I welcome you once again.
Thank you for having me.
Now that our introductions are done, permit me to jump right to my first question. Begin, Ms. Lewis, please share your general perspective on how the global carbon market is evolving today, as well as what major trends Africa as a continent should be paying close attention to.
Thank you for this question. I think it will really set the scene for the rest of the conversation today. So there are several what I would call mega trends when it comes to present outlook for carbon markets globally. So the first one is definitely growing interest of countries around the globe in setting up compliance carbon pricing schemes. So even countries that, we might typically not be thinking as being at the forefront of, climate policy ambition through different forms of carbon taxation, of carbon pricing, they're nevertheless establishing such instruments. And the main driver here is actually a response to CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, not only the one that the EU has already implemented and will start actually collecting the associated fees as of next year, but also other countries that have either started working towards implementation of their own CBAM or have started thinking through different considerations or consulting on such an idea. And one of the I would say design element of the EU CBAM and potentially other CBAMs as well is what we call third country carbon price recognition, which means that if the country of origin has its own carbon price, that price will be deducted from the price due at the border. So obviously this creates almost like a no-brainer type of policy rationale for the governments, especially in countries highly exposed or with high trade intensity with the countries that have or are implementing CBAMs. So this is one, I would say, mega trend, this proliferation of compliance carbon price instruments. That's definitely something that is a very recent trend. The next one, since we have spoken about that growing interest in compliance carbon price instruments, is the inevitable question about the convergence of voluntary and compliance carbon markets. The question is like to what extent they can, coexist without any type of interplay or interdependency, and to what extent they actually should be integrated. So maybe we'll be discussing it later on in the program, but this open question mark around the convergence is definitely maybe not a trend really yet, but definitely an area of interest and something that especially corporates are paying very close attention to. Then definitely a trend that we are seeing is an interest coming from actually all of the parties to the Paris Agreement and implementing or taking advantage or benefiting from the flexibilities under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, either in terms of this framework helping them deliver their own NDCs if they are to be buyer countries, or some countries, they look at the promise of Article 6 as something that might attract investments into the country, generate carbon offsets, then that then will be used by the buyer countries or by buying corporates to fulfill their decarbonization objectives. And this is specifically driven by the demand for CORSIA-aligned carbon credits. CORSIA is Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. This is an obligatory scheme for international airlines. And essentially, to meet the requirements under CORSIA, airlines will need to buy technically, making it simplified, Article 6 credits. So there definitely is an interest, or we can call it that mega trend in having the right enabling framework for the countries to be delivering these credits, because there is a real market need for them. And I think these are the three main ones, and hopefully we'll have some time to delve a little bit deeper into each of them in the subsequent part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lewis, for giving us this global perspective on where the trend is going, our markets globally. I will be directing this next question to Mr. Ibrahim Shelleng, just to provide some sort of local continental context to carbon markets. So the question is, what role should, as one of Nigeria's largest economies, what role should Nigeria be playing in shaping the continent's carbon market design framework, get the continent ready for a major market lift, especially along the pathways of regulations tailored to local realities, community participation, and lock-in access to early-stage project finance and domestic demand boost?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think Kasia has kind of set the tone for this conversation. Nigeria in Africa, obviously being one of the largest economies, really needs to step up, I believe, in terms of carbon markets and generally green financing. One of the major aspects of carbon markets, I think, is in terms of transparency. And with that, having the right regulation tailored to African realities. I think that's one of the things that Nigeria can focus on. Generally, carbon markets has essentially been, should I say, driven by developed countries, but we need to start having African contexts in developing our carbon markets. Codifying the value chain end to end, I think, is one of the first things that we need to focus on. So in terms of issuance of no objection letters and Article 6 authorization rules, it's vital that we have that transparency. We still have not yet developed our national registry, which I think is key. Provides us with public dashboards that the public can look at and understand what is happening within their localities. We also need clear carbon rights. So in areas where carbon projects are being developed, things like land tenure, things like ownership, data ownership. It's important that communities are carried along in that process. We also need safeguards for, especially for double counting. With the Article 6 framework now being implemented, one of the things that the country needs to guard against is double counting, which is one of the surest ways of ensuring you have integrity in the carbon markets. So the Climate Change Act and the NCCC obviously saddled with that responsibility of regulations and ensuring that these kind of the Intergovernmental Committee on Carbon Market Activation has developed the regulations for carbon markets, which hopefully should be approved quite soon. Aside from the regulations, also, I think it needs to be simplified in such a way that it is not should I say text driven or text heavy. So perhaps some sort of rule book that simplifies the process, I think, is key. And being able to table that across to, for instance, the African Union or the ECOWAS, to be able to harmonize market regulations amongst different countries. For instance, Ghana has its own regulations, I believe South Africa, Kenya. So we need to kind of harmonize all these various regulations from these different countries, I believe, to be able to kind of create a continental approach to carbon markets, because we do have an opportunity to come together, which also provides, I would say, a strength in negotiation. Community participation as well is as I mentioned earlier, is vitally important. Benefit sharing for local communities needs to be clear, and I don't think it has been explicit so far, especially in Nigeria's regulations, but it's still a work in progress. But I think Kenya, for instance, have quite clear benefit sharing rules within their own regulations. Data is going to be one of the key things for driving carbon markets. So having that registry and having people have access to data is also going to be one of the key themes for driving our carbon markets. And I think we also need to have some sort of aggregation to be able to scale some of the projects. For instance, potentially Nigeria has a lot of mini projects happening in various areas, but due to lack of scale, some of these projects may not be able to access carbon credits. So there needs to be some level of maybe aggregation for local projects such as maybe clean cook stoves, agroforestry projects, that can aggregate and create sizable credits. In terms of access to early stage project finance, the carbon markets provide us with an opportunity to potentially get funding that is not debt funding. But again, this requires perhaps some sort of carbon project development facility anchored with the likes of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, BOI. I think even the African Development Bank, can provide some level of funding for early stage projects. There are also opportunities for, what I would say, forward purchase, so pre-financing of carbon projects, and this, in a way, will also help, early stage project financing, because the problems that a lot of these projects will face is, not even having the funding to do feasibility studies and to kind of de-risk the initial stage of these projects to allow investments to pool in. So it's important that we have that, kind of platform. There needs to also be what I would call a domestic demand boost, right? So how do we generate that domestic demand to get people interested in carbon markets, understanding them, and being able to come up with projects that can generate significant credits. I think Nigeria potentially has one of the largest stocks in terms of carbon. There are some low-hanging fruits. We are petro state, so even when you look at our oil and gas sector, some of the low-hanging fruits could be things like methane abatement, our cement industry, aviation industry. All of these industries have potential low-hanging fruits in terms of being able to come up with projects that can generate significant credits. So going on the theme of transparency as well, public procurement and disclosure. So you want a situation where there is clear disclosure in terms of the process from end to end, because what this does is also provides that transparency for potential investors into this market. Why is Nigeria potentially well placed to lead this? I think what we have, aside from the size of our economy and the influence we have, especially in West Africa, with ECOWAS, for instance, is we are able to activate. If we're able to activate our climate carbon market policy in good time and get kind of that first mover advantage, I believe we're able to set a model that the rest of the continent can also follow. Working with the African Carbon Market Initiative, it gives us that, should I say, that first mover advantage I mentioned earlier. But certainly Nigeria has a major role to play in terms of carbon markets in Africa.
Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Shelleng. I was able to note down a few things and just basically understand that Nigeria still has a long way to designing a conducive regulatory environment for carbon trading. Staying with the global lens for a moment, the carbon market is no longer an experimental frontier. It has matured into a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem governed by an expanding network of credible and specialized institutions. Europe has long led the way with the emissions trading system, still standing as one of the largest carbon markets globally. In the US, state-led initiatives continue to shape emission trading, while Asia marked a major turning point in 2021 with the launch of China's national carbon market, the largest in the world by volume. What lessons do you think Africa can draw from the experiences of these established markets in Europe, Asia, and Latin America? And more importantly, how can Nigeria and Africa build the credibility needed to ensure that their carbon credits are recognized and trusted on the global exchange?
Thank you for this question. And I think it is very actually laudable that you are looking at these international experiences because, no country is in this on its own. And I really think there is such a tremendous value in understanding the lessons learned, but also, missteps and unintended policy consequences that the other countries that may be, implementing their systems some time ago, they had to learn the hard way. Obviously, these best practices or approaches, they always have to be tailored and customized to the local circumstances when they are transposed, but still they offer a really valuable starting point in assessing the realm of possibilities, or what is the inventory of different carbon market policy tools that could be looked at and leveraged on to design the local domestic framework. So maybe one kind of overarching remark, and this especially relates to how the EU has been running their emissions trading system, which was launched actually 20 years ago. So now it is celebrating its 20th anniversary. So from the beginning, the ETS was designed as a system that wasn't static, that will be evolving. So this evolution was baked into the very premise, the legislative premise of the system. So the policymakers at those predetermined intervals were actually forced to revisit the entire scheme, assess its functionality and its effectiveness, and introduce the necessary changes. So right now the EU is on its phase 4 of the emissions trading system that will run until the end of this decade. So I think this is a very important point, that this policy has to be evolving. There will be lessons to be learned, but also the potential expansion of the system into new, greenhouse gases, new sectors. It should be phased in. It can't be all at once. So this is one, I think, observation that countries should potentially get inspired by, that they, and this understanding, maybe this humble understanding, that it's such a tricky domain, right? We are, it's like an intersection of like economic welfare and various social issues, and the industry competitiveness, and the climate policy objectives, and principles of fairness, etc. So much goes into this. It's a complex fabric, and so we should be understanding that we might not get everything right from the beginning. So going into this, the design with this mindset, I think is very helpful. And then also maybe looking more specifically at carbon markets and experiences from other countries, we should also ask ourselves the question, which market segment are we thinking about? Because primarily we have the compliance carbon markets and voluntary ones. I mentioned that at the beginning. So there are different policy solutions for each of those. So while the EU has, like I mentioned, a very robust carbon market for compliance obligations, it almost doesn't have a carbon market for on the voluntary side of things, simply because the EU hasn't really been recognizing offsets for quite some time, being highly critical of the integrity of the offsets that were available on the market. So in terms of the voluntary carbon market, probably other jurisdictions would offer more helpful approaches that they have deployed. So some jurisdictions, like in California, offsets are issued by the governmental authority, by the regulator. So this is one solution, right? So instead of letting carbon credits being issued by different non-governed entities or institutions, let's have it actually centralized, and let's have the governmental oversight. So that's one way of doing things. Another way of doing things, and that goes back to this integration between VCM and compliance, is for the government to potentially ensure the integrity by allowing the use of some percentage of voluntary carbon offsets for the compliance purposes, but by requiring those offsets to meet stringent thresholds of quality. So this is the approach, for instance, of Singapore, although they are kind of moving now towards actually only allowing Article 6 credits. But then you have this standard that the companies will be striving to meet, because obviously the offsets that can be used for compliance carry this quite considerable financial premium. So these are some of the experiences that can be looked at. Obviously, when we are specifically on the compliance side of things, then you can break down, the whole policy design into individual elements. Especially when we talk about emissions trading systems, what is the role, if any, of free allowances? What are the instruments to govern price volatility? How are the allowances treated from the legal, accounting, and tax standpoint, etc. So then you have like a myriad of questions around, best practices for the design of these specific elements. And maybe going back to the question on building the credibility and ensuring that carbon credits generated in Nigeria or in Africa at large can be recognized and trusted in global exchanges, I think primarily what is needed here are the local regulations governing the process and procedure for the issuance of those credits in the respective jurisdiction. So obviously for Article 6 credits, those procedures, they primarily stem out of the framework of the Paris Agreement. They just need implementation on the local level, on the national level. But even for the DCMs, let's not have them let's not put them on par with, voluntary meaning unregulated. I think actually the market actors right now, they need regulation. They need to know that even if they invest in purely, BCM type of project, they still follow some local procedure that ensures that the project and the ensuing credits meet any local legal requirements. And they actually, the corporates and the investors, they prefer that rather than to say, well, we couldn't identify any applicable legal provision, so we just did it, completely, with no governmental oversight and visibility. So that part, having that applicable legal framework, will help when the credits or the project is subject to due diligence. For the legal part of the due diligence, the buyers, the off-takers will be able to say, okay, from the legal standpoint, these processes were followed. They are actually hardwired into the national law. So, we are fine on that front. Obviously, there are other parts of the due diligence, but on the legal side of things, we're good to go. So that will be my recommendation. Obviously, we can have this discussion, can go on and on, because there are so many aspects to bring up, but I think these are the primary considerations in that respect.
Thank you very much, Louise. Louise, that was quite an insightful dive into the policies that Africa can adopt to frame its own emission trading system. So the next question will be directed to Mr. Ibrahim Shelleng. And Nigeria recently launched its carbon market activation policy with the vision of becoming the leading African hub for high integrity carbon markets in investment, while setting a benchmark for low carbon, climate resilient socio-economic development. Will you break down the key objectives of this policy and how to put Nigeria ahead, considering that countries like Kenya, South Africa, and Ghana have already made significant strides in shaping their own carbon market framework? What lessons can Nigeria learn from their experiences? And more importantly, how do you think Nigeria can leverage these insights to position itself as a true regional hub for carbon trading?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I'll start off by kind of, explaining what the carbon market activation plan, is setting out to do. As you mentioned, the vision or the ambition is to make Nigeria a leading African hub for high integrity carbon market investments. You're looking at a potential 2.5 billion market potential by 2030. What the CMAP has done has taken a twin market route. Like Kasia was mentioning earlier, some countries maybe go VCM, some are fully Article 6, but Nigeria has decided to go with a twin market approach. So there will be an active use of the VCM and also Article 6 with making sure that there's robust accounting and corresponding adjustments to prevent the double counting that I mentioned earlier. Now, why is that? We could have fully gone Article 6, or we could have just said, stay with the voluntary carbon markets. But, it's important that we're also looking at our own context. We are not necessarily a high-emitting country. So, the carbon markets essentially is, a potential opportunity to bring in much-needed investments into the country. So it's almost a backward integration mechanism to, first of all, create projects that we're able to sell credits internationally and generate revenue for the country, whilst also looking forward to potentially developing a more compliance mechanism in the future. But again, the processes, need to happen kind of organically, should I say, because you'd need to have institutional capacity to be able to ensure that a compliance system, is well articulated and can be implemented properly. In terms of pricing signals, I think Kasia also mentioned this. So the government is also considering a carbon tax, starting with perhaps some selected industries, the energy sector, for instance, and have a coherent kind of legal framework that gives investors some level of predictability, so that we don't have major volatility in pricing. But underpinning all this, I think the regulatory framework that has been developed, and also the manual of procedures, which provides clear approval guidelines, reporting and integrity standards, provides that clarity for potential investors. In terms of institutional clarity as well, the National Council on Climate Change is the nationally designated authority. And part of the carbon market activation plan is also the establishment of a carbon markets office, which will issue the necessary authorizations, and also have registries for that transparency and corresponding adjustments. I think how can Nigeria, or how does this put Nigeria ahead? I think the model that Nigeria is using, so having that VCM plus Article 6, what that does is it creates that transparency and also provides opportunities for various level of investors. As I said, the compliance market in Nigeria is something that we are looking for in the future to establish. But given our current situation, as mentioned, being that we're looking for investments, to go into mitigation and adaptation, the idea is that backward integration mechanism. The manual of procedures, as I mentioned, provides things like the fees, the timelines for transaction processes, which also makes it easier for that kind of audit process for investors that are looking to invest in our carbon markets. What have we learned from our peers in other African countries? for instance, Kenya, I think what they've done is they've been able to kind of hard code their benefit sharing into their regulations. So, there's a clear mechanism for benefit sharing. I think things like land-based and non-land-based, there are clear percentages in terms of what goes to those communities. Also having transparent administrative fees and service levels. I think Kenya has been able to do that as well. Sets the fees and responsibilities of the various institutions involved, and I think Nigeria can mirror that and have clear timelines for these processes. Ghana has been able to also move quite far ahead. I believe they've set up their carbon market office, and they also have their registries. I think the Article 6 process has undergone technical review by the UNFCCC, which provides that kind of operational benchmark for their operations. And I think this is one of the things that Nigeria can learn from and hard code that into its regulation. South Africa is more anchored on compliance, and given their own particular situation and having perhaps more developed industrial systems, and so that compliance mechanism perhaps suits them much better. So I think what we're doing currently, we must also understand that it is still a relatively new market, so there needs to be a lot of understanding at the various levels, both government and private sector. But I think what from the position of government can do is, first of all, provide that kind of clear template and process for potential developers to understand exactly what is required and what the processes are and what the various institutional arrangements are to ensure that if they are investing in this market, they can see a clear pathway for how the potential projects will go, and how their own returns will also come out. So I think we'll probably discuss a bit further in terms of some of the other items that I said, because it's the markets are vast. But I think what we have been able to do so far is set the pace, by having these policy framework in place, and also that the manual of procedures, which hopefully will be approved at the highest level of government, which is the Federal Executive Council, and that provides that regulatory and investor confidence, to be able to really pull in significant funding into the market.
And if I could add to that, there are two interesting things from my perspective that I noticed in the CMAP. They're interesting because I'll mention in a second what they are, and while they are not, these 2 points are not making any definitive statement, they are creating like a really great flexibility to be further explored. And these two things pertain to the potential to integrate VCM, or I understand also by extension Article 6, into the carbon pricing mechanism, if such is implemented later on. I think the wording is that Nigeria will consider a carbon pricing mechanism that incorporates the VCM. So this is like a great foundational provision that, like from the start, from the get-go, does recognize the need to consider how the two can be reconciled or integrated. And the other one, also a similar approach towards the flexibility is towards VCMs vis-a-vis Article 6, especially Article 6.2. So there is that mention that Nigeria will consider authorizing or giving authorization and corresponding adjustment towards voluntary carbon credits under Article 6.2. So essentially, it will mean that carbon offset projects developed under VCM can be then perhaps transitioned into Article 6.2, which immediately will position them more strategically. Again, they might carry a higher price or some sort of financial premium. And this will also allow, I think the most important implication of this is that now the corporates might have direct inroad into Article 6.2. So they will not need to go through the avenue of, the buyer country entering into bilateral agreement, and only then corporates can engage in Article 6.2 activities, because there are a number of corporates from countries who are not intending to enter into Article 6.2 bilateral agreements, like Germany, for instance. So the whole, German business, or all of German businesses of Germany, if they want to generate or originate Article 6.2 ETMOS, they can't go through the buyer country avenue. So I think that's really great. And I understand, that's a nascent policy, but already embedded in it, we have this flexibility and mutual recognition or transitional mechanisms that really, I think, will be looked at very favorably by investors.
Very interesting to hear Nigeria's approach to carbon market framework, and the fact that we are looking to integrate both the VCMs and Article 6.2. Next question will be directed to you, Mr. Shelleng. Africa needs to be a critical player in the global carbon market, and it's a moot point not only because of its vast natural resources, but also because of the continent's vulnerability to the fallout impact of climate change. Carbon markets present an opportunity for the continent to attract climate finance, drive green economic growth, and potentially create jobs. And it's projected that Africa's carbon markets can expand by 15 to 20% annually, generating as much as $120 billion revenue by 2050. With this in mind, would you say it is sufficient motivation for African leaders to plug into the carbon agenda? And if yes, why is the extent of sovereign participation telling a different story?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, as I mentioned earlier, the carbon markets are still, relatively new, and it's a new opportunity. But, the incentives are there, certainly for Nigeria and Africa as a whole to tap into this. The scale of opportunity is massive. Africa controls, roughly over maybe 30% of global carbon sequestration potential with, forests, we have mangroves, renewable energy potentials. You're looking at, well over $100 billion potential revenue, in the next 10, 20 years, this is based on, the current potentials that are there. So if you look at it, it will certainly rival, things like the oil and gas export revenues that currently exists. There's also the developmental potential. So carbon markets can unlock job creation. You have MRVs, you have project development, there's technology transfer, and then the rural or community benefit sharing that will also bring rural income and foreign exchange inflows to the country. So in terms of its potential, it's certainly there. But why has there been perhaps a hesitation from various countries. I think it's probably based on a number of things. I would say maybe there's a slight trust deficit. Africa historically has been an extractive continent. So there's perhaps that hesitation from sovereign states who don't have a clear understanding of carbon markets and may perceive it as some sort of land grab or extractive in terms of the value that these carbon credits have. So there's probably some sort of hesitancy, and then leaders being worried perhaps of selling carbon credits cheaply, right? Whilst you have these developed countries buy off these offsets and continue their business as usual, and then in an African context, we're being told, well, we need to reduce our emissions, but we're also looking at how we can develop. So I think that is one of the aspects that creates that hesitation. There's also an institutional gap in terms of readiness. I think, yes, Nigeria has been able to develop that framework to have, things like the designated national authorities, looking to create registries and the likes, but that's not the case with other African countries. And, until we get to that level where there's that, level of understanding and creating those structures to protect, African economies, there'll still be that, perhaps hesitation. And look, let's also look at it in the context of what African economies are facing. Majority of governments in Africa are preoccupied with fiscal crisis, debt servicing, things like energy subsidies. So the carbon markets looks more like a futuristic and long-term and quite technical kind of instrument to operationalize, which makes it difficult for you to kind of get that across or put that across politically. Trying to get the buy-in of a country that doesn't necessarily understand the market is tough. So that also creates that. And I think, in terms of unity, so, you have countries, for instance, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria now, and South Africa moving, but, kind of moving in silos. And without having that kind of pooling and having, I think, a continental framework to drive this market, you'll continually have hesitancy. So you might have the large economies being able to move ahead, but then others potentially may be left behind. So it's important that we also have some sort of pooling of sovereignty under a continental framework that will help encourage other countries that have not necessarily been able to move forward with their carbon activation. Because what you potentially see is that the countries that have been able to move forward and set up clear regulations end up dominating the market, and investors would move towards that particular country, and other African countries may be left behind. So I think there certainly needs to be more motivation. Africa in general has the huge potential to be able to generate significant number of credits, and which would also bring much needed revenue to Africa. But I think political economy, capacity gaps, and really a mistrust of the carbon financing mechanisms is one of the things that we need to look at and see how, from a continental perspective, are able to drive that narrative to see it as a real opportunity to generate revenue for the continent. And that revenue also needs to be channeled into the right areas. If some of these revenues are coming in from carbon markets, we would expect that this funding goes into adaptation. Africa is one of the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. So it's important that the funding that is generated from carbon markets are also channeled into adaptation and creating that climate resilience for the continent to be able to develop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shelleng. The points you've made have really helped put perspective Africa's struggles with operationalizing a carbon market that reaches its potential, and you have also helped us identify the gaps and that needs to be tackled. Thank you once again. My next question is to you, Ms. Lewis. Bearing in mind that the carbon projects are capital intensive, what do you say are the forms of financing models that would work for Africa's heavily nuanced market? And knowing that other developed markets have pushed blended finance solutions, guarantee products, and tax incentives to activate the market and move projects from just ideas to bankable initiatives.
Yes, thank you for this. Well, I think when it comes to carbon offset projects, and here we're looking at the offset side of the equation, not at the allowances, which represent right to emit. Offsets represent the emission reduction or removal. So when it comes to carbon offset projects, I would say that we can apply this old adage of, it takes a village, right? It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to deliver a carbon offset project. And especially at these relatively early days. And it takes a village because there is definitely a space for different market players who help to de-risk the project. Because we cannot kid ourselves. The risks are theirs, and the issue is that the risks, the carbon offset specific risk, they come on top of the typical risks that any project has to somehow address and accommodate and mitigate. So we have a role for different players. So typically in this complex ecosystem, and that goes also to or that has relevance as to what type of financing models are applied. So typically we will have the investor or the financier, we'll have the project developer or project proponent. We will have an off-taker, we'll have the insurance provider. If we have blended finance type of arrangement, then we'll have also like a multilateral development bank providing their portion of financing. And then obviously we have those other market players, infrastructure providers, verifiers, etc. But even the stakeholders directly involved in the delivery of the project are the ones that I mentioned, and this is quite a few. So obviously the downside is that then the proceeds will need to be divided into all of these actors. But then again, the advantage is that the risk is shared among all these actors. So possibly this can unlock the potential to invest in more projects. And all of the instruments that you mentioned can be deployed depending on the specific parameters of a given project. Like some of them are, private sector driven, whether they will, for instance, use the insurance or not, but others are dependent on the availability of different fiscal instruments and incentives offered by the government. And this plays more into the role that the government of a given country sees itself in when it comes to the facilitating the trade in carbon offsets. So you mentioned, for instance, tax incentives. Obviously, they can only be taken advantage of if they are provided for. So obviously, this topic is very, very complex on the financing models. Maybe I will just add one more thing before we get too much into the weeds. But the kind of overarching idea behind carbon markets is that they should unlock the potential to pursue projects, decarbonization projects, that otherwise would be unattainable because the business model just doesn't hold up. And this specifically pertains to the technology-driven or technology-based projects. So typically you can think of, let's say, utility company from Europe. They want to electrify a country, let's say in Africa. So there is like a real business proposition behind it, because there will be a real commodity generated out of this investment with the associated revenues, which is electricity. So if this electricity is going to be produced through renewable energy sources, well, typically the utility company would actually charge a premium because it is a renewable energy source. However, in a lot of countries, the consumers are not ready to pay this premium, and so the project just falls through. And here come the carbon market. Here come the carbon markets that can offer this additional revenue stream, now making this whole project financially viable, because you will have double offtake. You'll have the offtake of green energy and you'll have the offtake of carbon credits. So this complicates the whole financial arrangement by this duality of the offtake, but it also that's the hope. It can really push a lot of those great projects, over the viability line, and can really deliver transformative projects to countries, to continents, to regions like Africa. So we're not just talking about maybe more, I would say, reactive in a way, nature-based projects. And I don't want to be critical at all, but maybe let's think about carbon markets as a way to deliver this infrastructural transformation of entire continents, because this financial gap that is out there will be closed. So that is my main fascination, to be honest, with carbon market, and that goes back to the question on the financing models, because obviously the whole financing model looks completely differently if we now take into consideration other types of commodities that will be generated as a result of these projects.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lewis. That was quite some insight you shared on financing models and bankability of projects through the carbon market. My next question will be going to Mr. Ibrahim. Looking at Africa, do you think the African continental free trade area could play a transformative role in how the continent engages with carbon markets? Do you see the potential for a continental framework for carbon trading that could strengthen Africa's collective bargaining power on what stage? Or would you say that ACMI is sufficient for playing that role?
Yeah, so I think the AFTA could potentially be a game changer. The ACMI is not backed by law, whereas the AFTA is backed by law. So there's going to be a kind of a complementary approach. So I don't see one replacing the other, but there's certainly a complementary approach. I think the AFTA can supply the kind of binding cross-border rules, payment rails, and dispute settlements that the ACME won't be able to do. So by being able to make it law with protocols, there's investment, competition, intellectual property. So it's legally binding as opposed to being some sort of initiative. I think what also can happen with AFTA is that cross-border data and services. So having some sort of perhaps digital trade protocol that looks at things like MRV data flows, that is able to verify things remotely, ease of investments as well. So having that cross-border ease of investment, and you could also aggregate various countries to have projects by having that AFTA framework. We think if you look at things like even payments, by utilizing the Pan-African payment systems, potentially buyers and developers can settle in local currencies. You can have some sort of AFTA-wide FX marketplace that helps to kind of de-risk carbon market transactions, on the continent. And generally, you could have that AFTA being the coordinating entity for continental carbon markets, similar to what you have, for instance, in Europe with CBAM. So, having standardized integrity rules and transparency frameworks as well. So yes, I think what will happen is that you would have both entities complementing each other. Having things like mutual recognition of Article 6 authorizations, standardized. We have also an issue of language within the African continent. So, Nigeria is surrounded, for instance, by Francophone countries. So there's also these kind of things that need to be addressed. We also need to look at perhaps potentially having a continent-wide registry, which I think the AFTA, given the legal backing or the legal framework that it has, can provide that. Benefit sharing is another thing to look at. Yes, individual countries have their own benefit sharing mechanisms, but I think having the AFTA have some sort of base level, so there should be a minimum level of benefit sharing for carbon market projects. I mean, maybe countries could potentially increase based on their local nuances, but I think it's important to have that base level to ensure equitable benefit sharing amongst countries in Africa. So I mean, ACME still fits in terms of what it could do. So things like pipelines of transactions, ACME can still play an active role. Creating that demand as well, demand signals, being able to mobilize the supply and demand side, helping, as it's currently doing, activating other carbon markets in different countries in Africa. Assisting with development funding with various DFIs as well. So I think there's a lot of work for both entities to be able to do, and it's not as Kasia said, it takes a community. So it's not just to rely on one particular mechanism, but having various players working together to be able to drive this market.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim. As a follow-up to my previous questions, we see countries like Kenya already implementing a sizable number of projects under voluntary carbon standards, such as the Vera and Gold standard, while others like Nigeria are still in the early stages of, developing their markets. How do you think this uneven progress across the continent might affect Africa's ability to coordinate? And what steps do you suggest are needed to bring everyone along?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, you have different countries now that have been able to move ahead of others. Again, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, three major players within the continent. And naturally, I think what happens is that investors will move to where the regulations are clear, rules are clear, because that also de-risks their investments. But also what that does, I think I've mentioned this earlier, is that you tend to have the risk of over concentration in those countries, and then perhaps other countries are bypassed. I think you also have kind of a weakened collective bargaining. So if you only have maybe 3 or 4 countries out of 54 countries in Africa that are carbon ready, the strength of the negotiation I think is certainly weakened. So it's important that you have more and more countries coming on board onto this market to be able to I think strengthen our negotiation in terms of having that high level pricing of credits coming out of Africa. If you have that uneven progress, so what potentially could happen is that the countries that are maybe late onto the game may potentially look to underprice their credits just to be able to attract investors, and this in its own as well could also undermine the market. So it's important that we're all kind of moving along, so that you don't have that situation where a country now develops markets and wants to attract investors and underprices their credits just to be able to attract those investors. So I think it's important that is done effectively. What steps will be needed to bring everybody along? I think it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to have some sort of continental level approach in things like carbon rights, benefits sharing, having a common registry that is driven by technology, and then recognition of also host country authorization. So we don't have need for maybe double authorizations. That essentially slows down some of these processes. There needs to be a need, I think, continent-wide for improving capacity within this market. So that understanding right the way through, I think, bottom up, top down, for people to understand this market and being able to effectively participate in it. Technical assistance is crucial. You need that technical assistance from from the developed world, whether it's things like templates for letter of authorization. Some of the things that Nigeria is currently doing is engaging the likes of the World Bank to be able to have standardized templates, which also makes this the standardization certainly helps when it comes to providing that clarity for investors. So I think there's a lot to unpack, and in terms of the movement, we have to move collectively, and that collective movement, critically will help the negotiation process when it comes to pricing effectively credits that are coming out of Africa. But we can't have that without having the right institutions, the right frameworks, and the right transparency that ensures that credits coming out of Africa are seen as high integrity and also commands the correct level of pricing that is required.
Very much, Mr. Shelleng. I think your insights have actually described the situations and the areas that Africa as a continent needs to look out to be able to compete with global carbon markets. And everybody needs to understand that this is a job for everybody, and some countries while they might pioneer it, everybody needs to be carried along. As we begin to round off, let's talk about what it takes to get it right. And I'll direct this question to Ms. Lewis. For Nigeria and for other African countries, what strategic steps and policy directions are needed to build carbon markets that are not just credible and well regulated, but also capable of driving economic growth in real terms?
Thank you for the question. I think we have discussed a lot of these policy dimensions that should underpin the framework, the carbon market framework that will deliver economic growth, obviously in a balance with those other objectives, especially around social justice, adaptation, and the like. So perhaps I will maybe share a thought along a little bit different angle. But again, this is something very much needed when we are talking about building a well-crafted, well-implemented solution. So this is the talent force and the right, I would say, capability in country to help in this process of learning by doing. As I mentioned before, it will be an iterative process, where mistakes will happen, they will need to be corrected. So we need to have the right talent to be able to address these challenges and carry this forward. So I think it is quite important, as Nigeria is at the precipice of this really, I would say, groundbreaking policy innovation, which is introduction of carbon market, to have people with different skill sets being able to address the different market elements, from the policy design, from running the registry, people in the financial sector, central bank or financial institutions being able to understand what kind of commodity they are dealing with, what these new carbon offsets, carbon credits are in terms of, how to define them, how to trade in them, obviously, verification. So there is like a whole plethora of areas of expertise that will need to be supplied and actively provided. So I really want to make this this appeal, but also, to the maybe younger people thinking about their career paths. I can say from my experience, I was there again at the beginning, like at the beginning of my career as a lawyer, actually coincided with the introduction of the EU emissions trading system. And I'm still here 20 years later, being throughout all this time actively involved in this field. So, lawyers, accountants, tax people, engineers, you name it, traders, all of them will need to either like fully concentrate on carbon markets, or at least be able to deliver the required type of expertise, maybe on the back end of something else that they're doing. So it's actually quite common that, especially in the early days, you have people, let's say you can have like a tax professional, a CPA, who does, regular tax work on a daily basis, but then also is able to address or answer questions on the tax treatment of carbon credits. And going forward, probably we'll see more and more people being fully involved in different aspects and angles of carbon markets. So I would really like to, pivot to this area, because without people, without talent, without experts, we won't go far. And we want to also, they need to not only think about, how to attract investors, that's critically important, but also how to appeal to, to the people in the workforce, so that they are confident that going into this field, they can make careers out of it. So that's kind of, I think, my contribution towards the end of our discussion, that this all, where the carbon market in Nigeria will be as strong as the minds and imaginations and expertise of the people who will be building it going forward.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lewis. That was such an insightful perspective, bringing it from the angle of talent and expertise, plus the people, what makes it work. Mr. Shelleng, do you mind just putting in your 50 cents, any additional perspective on this question, please?
Yeah, I think Kasia has spoken very well, and just to add that for us, being in the position to kind of create that policy and market enablement, it's really exciting times, for the country. I tend to look at it as going back to the 1950s in Oloibiri, when oil was first discovered in Nigeria, right? That's how I view this carbon markets. It's a potential game changer if we're able to harness the potentials that it can provide. And one of the things I'm excited about is that we are potentially looking to transform our economy, but by also doing so in such a way that aligns with current global narratives of green industrialization. And I think this definitely provides us with that opportunity. So it's exciting times, and I'm really hoping that the country and the continent really can also really key into this market and use that as a tool for development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shelleng. Thank you, Ms. Lewis, for making time out of a busy schedule to join us today. It has been a very, very interesting and insightful conversation. I've learned to look at things from a new perspective, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. I would also like to say a very big thank you to our listeners. As always, the conversation continues on our social media handles, and do remember to send us your comments and thoughts on today's episode.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is brought to you by DealHQ Partners. To find out more about our services, visit www.dealhqpartners.com. See you on the next episode.